So welcome everybody. It's a while since we've done one of these online only events, but they've got the advantages of us being able to speak to people who are not in the UK. So this is great. You may notice that I'm not and never have been Toby Young, who's the General Secretary of the Toby of the Free Speech Union. He hasn't transitioned. He is not here tonight, so it's me who's got the pleasure of talking to our guest. I'm Jan Macvarish, and I'm the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union. So welcome. My special guest tonight is Nellie Bowles. Nellie is the co-founder of the Free Press, which you can find at the fp.com. She writes the weekly, is it TGIF? Is that how you say it?
It's
Yeah.
TGIF.
Thank God it's Friday.
Thanks God it's Friday.
Yeah, okay. So the weekly newsletter, that's Nellie's department. So the Free Press was founded in 2021, initially as the Common Sense newsletter, I think, inspired by Thomas Paine, our
Yeah.
own lad. So the Free Press is now a highly successful media company, which describes itself as built on the ideals that were once the bedrock of American journalism. And I'm a real fan. I've been listening to the podcast, honestly, since it started, I think. And it's probably the one that I recommend most to other people, besides the Free Speech Union's own podcast, That's Debatable, which also goes out weekly. And I know that my dog gets much longer walks when there's a new Honestly episode out. So she likes it too. And there's just, you have an incredible range of interviews, debates, roundtables, some of them live, a lot of them in the studio. Everybody from Benjamin Netanyahu, which was a really fascinating interview a couple of years ago now, I think. Netanyahu to David Sedaris, who are some of the funniest episodes that I've listened to. And then most recently, a brilliant interview with Jerry Seinfeld.
Oh,
Um,
good.
yeah, amazing. And covering all of the most contentious political and cultural topics as they happen. And it's just been incredibly helpful as a compass, really, to think our way through the last few years. So I think it's fair to say that the Free Press has played a major role in giving shape to the new nebulous ideology that we've sort of come to know as woke, analysing its ideological underpinnings and giving a voice to those who are challenging it, as well as to some of those who are taking it forward as well and don't object to woke. And I think before we move on to Nellie's book, I just wanted to particularly mention the 7-part series that I assume you commissioned or platformed at the very least, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, which is just a fantastically deep exploration of how J.K. Rowling went from a hate figure for the religious right to a hate figure for many of those who would previously have been her biggest fans, the kind of alternative youth. And it is just such an enlightening series that, and I know a lot of Brits listen to that. Nellie, I think, lives in Los Angeles now.
Yeah,
And I think you were raised in San Francisco, if that's right. I've got that
I
from the
was.
yeah. And you were previously an award-winning correspondent at the New York Times. But tonight we're going to focus on Nellie's book called Morning After the Revolution, Dispatches from the Wrong Side of History. And you can purchase that from Primrose Hill Books if you're in the UK. I'm just going to put that link in the chat. Our friends at Primrose Hill always give us a good discount. They will only post to the UK, but you can buy it as we speak. So welcome to Nellie. Thank you very much for making the time.
So
Nellie
much
is
for having me.
Nellie's about to have a baby, so we're not going to go too long. So we're going to stick to an hour tonight, which I think is reasonable. And as I said to her before, it's boiling in my garret, so it's probably better for me as well that
But I love that, Garrett. It's beautiful.
you
So
wouldn't if you were
small.
here. The baby would be rushing to get out. So I've got some questions to put to Nellie first, and then we'll go out to the Q&A box. And you can start writing your questions in there at any point, and I'll read them out later, and we'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. So Nellie, the morning after the revolution. So I know certain smart asses are saying it references Joan Didion, her essay, and she was very much talking about the revolution of the counterculture
Yeah,
in 60s in San Francisco. To me, it reminded me as well of Katie Roiphe's book, The Morning After, from the early 90s, which was about the sexual revolution, in particular kind of that stage of feminism in the 90s on campus, where it was becoming increasingly obsessed with date rape and sort of victim feminism. And for me, Katie Royfe's book had a really transformative effect on my mindset, and I really turned against that particular form of feminism at the time. So I just wondered what is the revolution that you're referring to, the one that you think we're hungover from at the moment?
It's a good question because the revolution has resisted being named. And so we kind of rely on things like woke or these sort of terms, but it's a nebulous revolution that doesn't like to be described and doesn't like to be categorized and its members get very upset when you try to describe it, because part of the revolution is to say there's no revolution happening and there's no change happening at all. And if you notice a change, it's a good thing, but also stop noticing it. And so colloquially, people call it the woke revolution. In the book, I don't use that term. I use the term the new progressive because I wanted to highlight what I think a lot of it is, which is basically a battle within liberalism, within the broad left. So Democrats and socialists. And it's a battle to move that group leftward. So you have the new progressive who is up against the liberal. And most of the battles that I describe in the book, most of the chapters are sort of about the conflict between the new progressive and the liberal. And you can see it in a million of the anecdotes. I can go into specifics and if that's fun or useful right now. But let's say cancel culture. You don't cancel a Trumper or a conservative. That's not what that all was. Like now we're sort of seeing cancel culture start to a little bit wind down, although we can obviously talk about that more. But you don't see people try to cancel conservative, in part because where the cancellations would happen would not be in places that had any conservatives. It would be in academia, in newsrooms, in museums. That's where cancellations would happen. And what it would be is a leftist group pushing against sort of an old school liberal in their midst and saying, if you're not going to go along with the new line of politics, you're out, you're gone. And so the movement, the revolution was really a movement within liberalism to radicalize it, to make it further left, to say we're not the liberals of Obama and Bill Clinton, that we're a new thing. And we're going to be escalating a little bit. And that to me was a revolution.
But when to me it doesn't look like it doesn't look far left in the sense of Labour politics. It's not that kind of, I mean small L Labour politics, as in, trade unions, wages, even capitalist social relations. It's not that, is it? It's a different kind of hard left.
Yeah, you get into some weird tangles where, like, let's say the abolish the police movement, really, really interesting movement that came out of rage, rightful indignation and rage at the video of George Floyd being killed and being murdered. And the abolish the police movement being an answer is a very interesting one because, yes, it sees the problem that we all see, which is there's police officers who act badly. And it says, it says, we're going to instead put out, let's say, violence interrupters who are unarmed, no body armor, guys who are going to go out into the streets and just get involved in violent situations and de-escalate. And that was literally, and still remains and became very popular across the US, this idea of the violence interrupter. And you're right to point out that it's not a traditional leftist thing. There's something new going on, because to me, as sort of like a old world liberal, the idea of a bunch of guys going out who don't have pensions, who don't have unions, who don't have any protections, and that this is the solution versus our imperfect cops who have pensions, who have unions, who have all of those protections that like the traditional liberal has fought for. It's bizarre. And it doesn't totally read as like the sort of class politics leftism that you would think. that
No,
would
sounds
certainly not
more
be
like a
backed.
gig, a gig economy version of
It's
the
almost libertarian. It's
yeah.
like it's almost goes so far left, it goes all the way back to right. It's kind of like something that a conservative dream of, like, yeah, let's get rid of these unions, let's get rid of those pensions. That's a lot of money. And it's,
Hmm.
yeah, but that is how it took shape in the US. And if you questioned it, if you said, hey, violence interrupters aren't better than cops, we should just improve cops, maybe even fund them more to train them better. If you said that, and I have this in the book a bunch, but if you say that, you were smeared as a racist. You were smeared as literally a white supremacist for questioning that. Within American newsrooms for the last 3-4 years, it's basically been the default accepted position that you are for defunding the police. And if you're not, you're somewhat questionable. You're kind of like you're like the centrist or the conservative on the staff.
Mm.
I mean,
But
very
do you
bizarre.
think, so when you said about cancel culture in the US, it doesn't particularly go for the conservatives. It's a sort of narcissism of small differences, if you like, or a kind of purging of the liberals, of the old school liberals. Do you? I'm not sure that's it's not quite as tidy as that over here. I don't think. I think the sort of purge of the conservatives and the right maybe happened at a slightly earlier stage. Um, and I wonder if it's more, it seems to be, it's still conservatives and the right that get sort of monstered in that kind of way. But there hasn't been up until now a kind of alternative mediaverse for those people. Whereas in the States, maybe there was a bit more of a kind of conservative space where people could find a home and they could still have their voice heard and there could still be debates about things.
Mm.
I don't know what you think about that. I mean, over here, I think a lot of people would say, although we've had a conservative government,
Mm.
uh, it's very peculiar because we've got a conservative government, and yet what everybody always says at all of our meetings is, how on earth has this happened under a conservative government? And people don't really believe it was a conservative government. Uh,
Interesting.
yeah, so I just wondered that sort of that purging. You can definitely see that there's the kind of particularly vicious attacks, which you describe really well in the book. The pleasure of going for somebody and the pleasure of kind of distinguishing yourself from somebody. Can you just talk about your chapter on the joy of cancelling?
Yeah. Um, so I was trying to think of how to capture cancel culture for whatever, it became such a cliche idea. And I was like, how do I write about this thing that everyone's writing about? And it's so kind of predictable what someone in my position will write. And I was remembering the last couple of years and I was realizing, like, I've been part of canceling people. And in fact, I canceled someone I like a friend. And I figured I'd write about that. And because I think one thing that tends to happen when we talk about the new progressives or the woke movement or whatever you want to call it is there's like a flattening of it. And it's just like, oh, this is bad. This is dumb. This is silly. And I think a lot of it is silly and a lot of it is whatever. But you have to understand also why it won so thoroughly and why it was so successful in the first place. So I try to approach it as best as possible from a place of like explaining the human urges behind some of this. So in the case of cancel culture, I write about canceling a friend, and she had written a book. Someone quoted in the book didn't like it. My friend was white. The person who didn't like her quote, who was also a friend of mine, was black, and it was kind of this public moment on Twitter where everyone was bashing the person who wrote the book. And I was supposed to do an event with her to promote her book. I was supposed to go on stage with her. And I wrote her and I said, I won't go on stage with you. And she said, please reconsider. I'm really getting a lot of, and I said, no, I'm not going to platform you. And in describing it now, it's like, it's crazy. But at the time, I felt like it mattered a lot that people in my community and in our world were all aligned, and we needed to all be aligned in certain values. And it was more of a problem if someone within my little world did something bad, and that person, she needed to be punished for it. And it I in the book, I kind of like contrast that with, I have family members who are conservatives. There's no like, I can't cancel them, I can't punish them, they just are conservatives. There's no, I don't have influence or power over their lives because they're in separate ecosystems. But someone within your ecosystem is accessible, and I was part of that. And then basically the end of my time in the movement and the end of the book is when there was a time when all New York Times reporters, there was a day when we were all supposed to tweet the same tweet. It had kind of been declared that after the Tom Cotton op-ed came out, that we were all going to tweet the same tweet. Let me back up. Sorry, I'm speaking to a US. I'm realizing I'm speaking to a UK audience. The end of my time in the movement was when the op-ed editor of the New York Times put out a piece that said, Tom Cotton writes, send in the troops. And it was about Tom Cotton wanting to send in the National Guard to quell some of the protests and riots of 2020 and 2021. And everyone was supposed to basically say that putting out this op-ed puts Black lives and our colleagues in danger, because sending in the National Guard would have escalated the policing of the cities. And at the time, it was like any policing is asking for murder. Mm. But I knew the young editor who had commissioned that piece, and I couldn't do the cancellation that day. I couldn't send out the tweet that we were all supposed to tweet. I just couldn't do it. And I remember having like a breakdown in my apartment, like sweating and shaking. And I just couldn't send out the tweet. And basically by not doing that, I got a lot of messages from friends and colleagues that said, we're not friends anymore. And colleagues saying, you need to stand with your colleagues. We have to be a united front. You know how this works. And I basically just could not, I couldn't do it. And so I said no. And there are people I'd never heard from again after that. Real friends. And I, that cancel culture and those movements, those kind of spasms of like purification, they are about finding the person in your midst who's a betrayer, but they're also about coming together as a group. And it's like a potluck. It's like everyone brings what they can, everyone gathers together. It's a communal feeling that feels good when you're in it. And it feels good to do. It's a little like how women sometimes bond by talking shit about a third party. Like, sorry, I shouldn't swear, but it's like sometimes through being mean, you bond with your group, or an ousting. It's human nature. It's like tribal.
But what's the big enemy that justifies that? So the sense of, our colleagues were in danger, that sense of there being such a big threat that it's therefore justified to act in what in other circumstances would be a despicable way, and disloyal, and all of those kinds of things. So what was that moment where the threat of your opposition was imagined to be so great that clubbing together was so important? What was that? Was that post-Trump?
Yeah, I mean, the rhetoric started getting really heated. I think we've all seen over the last few years rhetoric in leftist progressive circles escalating and escalating and escalating. And that's not just silly rhetoric. The people who are writing it and saying it believe that. They genuinely believe that. They genuinely think that an op-ed calling for the National Guard might kill their colleagues. Like I don't want to say it became like a collective delusion, because I think that makes it sound a little bit more nutty. It became sort of like, I think people genuinely just think the stakes of all of these moments are very, very high. And if you say, I don't think the stake of this moment is that high, and I don't think this op-ed is going to murder my colleagues, that's enough to make yourself on the outs with it. So it's also very important for everyone to agree to the escalating language at all times.
Yeah.
And
Sorry.
no, I'm
Yeah, so
rambling.
this is where I'm so interested in the parallels here between uh the same, exactly the same, 2016, basically. So the election of Trump, defeat of Hillary, which you described as, as being devastating and very similar to what a
Devastating to me. Yeah.
yeah, and which a lot of people, who were Remainers over here in the Brexit referendum, that's exactly what they experienced when the UK voted to leave the European Union. It was just the same sort of reaction of feeling of shock. They didn't think it was going to happen. And especially Brexit, maybe even more so than the election of Trump. So certainly Brexit was a deep shock to a lot of people. And people felt like it wasn't just the kind of political realm that would change. It was like everything would change.
Mm.
Their children would have different futures, and every holiday would be different, and their job opportunities would be different. And it was really, and everything they could eat would be different. And and it was an existential sort of wobble that went on, a quite profound one. And it feels like there was something very, very similar going on in that same year. So Brexit happens in June, and then Trump, I think, November, December is elected. And I know in Britain we were watching that very closely as well. And there was a sense of, oh my God, the
It was
world
a
is
shock. It
really
was a
shaking.
total shock. And
Mm,
and the book, right, I write about really the progressives versus liberals, and it's really about the left broadly, right? But a lot of that heated rhetoric and the sort of drama of it for sure was stoked by Trump and Trump's heated rhetoric and like penchant for extreme and constant drama. Like he was not exactly a calming force over those 4 years. Although, what's interesting is that I think there were a lot of predictions that in 2020, with Biden coming in, that there'd be a cooling, that there would be here's this reasonable older man who has long been kind of moderate with his politics, seemingly. And like the heat and wildness of these Trump years will calm down. And
mm,
it didn't happen. And that was really I was shocked by that. And I still don't really know what to make of that. Like, why didn't Biden's arrival calm the movement? It didn't at all. The movement then escalated further. The rhetoric escalated further. And you had Trump kicked off Twitter. So he was, he's just ranting on Truth Social. It's not like his rhetoric was really in the bloodstream. Most of the mainstream media largely would ignore a lot of what he was posting on his Truth Social page.
mm.
So yeah, it's really interesting that I think Trump was a part of it and helped stir up the rhetoric and help escalate the language. But then it continued without even him in office. And um, yeah, but he was
Yeah,
kind of a
it
specter.
suggests it's the sort of the Trump derangement syndrome is the kind of really the madder end of things is based in the reaction to rather than
Yeah.
necessarily the stoking up. And that certainly is the way, because over here we had the kind of struggle over Brexit going on for 3-4 years
Mm.
before it was actually pushed through in Parliament. So we had a really long period where the fights were just being refought every day, really, without a conclusion. And then yeah, I just wonder where we're at now then. So, I mean, at that point, there was a sense that by amongst the left and liberals that there'd been a kind of devastating leap backwards, I think. Um, and
Yeah.
I wonder what then you have the 2020 and obviously the pandemic, which obviously
Yeah, the
also seems
pandemic
really
came
crazy.
about. I
um,
I think a lot of people had that devastation from Trump and had that feeling of chaos, and the pandemic came, more chaos. And there was a feeling a little bit, especially as the pandemic dragged on. Let's say after we got the vaccine available and we were all vaccinated, yet lockdowns continued. I think there was a feeling that maybe there could be a bigger reshaping of society. And maybe this sort of shakeup that the pandemic brought could be used in a way that continued the revolution. And it became clear pretty early that Biden would go along with a lot of politics and ideas that I think would have surprised people when he was running, and he was running as more of a moderate. And so I think the revolution got was savvy to that. And a lot of people use that moment of chaos to say, let's push for bigger change. Let's do this.
Was there something about the online, the way in which we were restricted during the pandemic, and the fact that on the one hand people were subjected to, for example, or volunteered to be part of like retraining programs, are the ones you describe, which I'll get you to describe in a moment, around race in particular and diversity. There was that aspect of things. There was these kind of teenage kids who didn't know what the hell to do with themselves and are off following influences around the trans ideology, as we were just talking about before we joined the call. And on the other hand, you have parents also, which a lot of people have described, seeing what their children were being taught in schools, which also then kind of from the other perspective, it sort of exposed those kind of new, very, very new and ideas that people didn't even know that had taken a grip really in our institutions. So I wonder what you think about that. So tell us about that online training thing that you do around race.
Yeah, well, the parent. Let me start first with the parents seeing what's going on at schools, because there's a chapter about San Francisco in the book where basically San Francisco, which has very pure progressive politics, there's no one there, there's no secret Republican there to like blame for any policy in San Francisco, and San Francisco had become somewhat of a mess. The downtown was crime ridden. The streets were seeing enormous numbers of deaths. I mean, more people died of fentanyl overdoses in San Francisco during the height of COVID than died of COVID, right? It was walking around, it was horrible. And what happened was a group of Asian parents started getting really activated by what the school board was doing and what was going on in schools, because they were watching kids home on Zoom school, and they were going to some of these school board meetings, which suddenly were very easy to watch because they were on Zoom. And there was an effort within the school board and within the kind of progressive, the like left movement in San Francisco, which you can imagine how left wing that is. And there was an effort to, like I said, use the pandemic as a moment for revolution. So they decided they're going to rename all the schools that were renamed for that had been named for problematic figures. So the school named after Abraham Lincoln had to be renamed because Lincoln was a racist, like these sort of things. They were spending all their time doing that. They weren't talking about reopening the schools. And they took the one elite public school that San Francisco really has, the Lowell school that you test into. It's like our version of Stuyvesant, if you know New York. And they eliminated the test, basically eliminating it as an elite school. And the Asian parents started questioning that. And the school board, their go-to response was to call them white supremacists and to say, these parents are arguing white supremacist talking points. A bunch of white supremacists are on the call. And they got really pissed off. And that instigated then what turned out to be San Francisco's really first moderate reformation, which was those parents gathering together to get the school board, half the school board recalled. Then they got the district attorney recalled. I mean, it was pretty amazing. So the Zoom kind of cut both ways. The pandemic lockdowns encouraged a lot of people to radicalize further, and they thought, we're going to use this opportunity. We don't have to be in classrooms. We're going to keep things shut even longer because we're doing a revolution here. And it allowed for a lot of people to see what was going on in previously a little bit unknown spaces. Now, the anti-racist trainings, they're, along with all this stuff we're talking about, cancel culture and the parents seeing what's going on at school and whatnot, over the last really couple decades in the US, there has been a move within the anti-racist movement to shift from doing tangible things in the world, changing laws, doing, convincing people who are unconvinced. There's been a move away from that towards a more therapeutic model of anti-racism. And part of it came from a list that I became obsessed with. This white lady anti-racist educator put out a list of what she called white supremacy characteristics. And the list includes things like perfectionism, individualism, right to comfort, worship of the written word. And she said, these traits are white traits. And valuing this is a white thing to value. And one thing we need to do to eliminate our racism is to work on getting these traits out of ourselves. And this became the bedrock principle. This idea became the bedrock principle of the new anti-racist movement, which, I mean, this list, now people try to downplay it. They try to say this list never existed or it never was influential. The Smithsonian Museum put out a poster, a graphic design with the list, so you could have it in your home or your classroom. I mean, this was very much adopted. It made it into the California curriculum. I mean, it made it into our school curriculums as a sort of footnote to say, this is why we're teaching things this way, because of this, because objectivity is whiteness. And so off of that, then what do you do? The next step is to gather together people and work on their objectivity, their perfectionism, all of these things that are so white, and you have to get rid of them. And it turns out, who loves that? White women love to get together and talk about how bad they are, and how their perfectionism is oppressive. It's oppressive to them, and maybe it's oppressive to someone else, sure. And so there was a whole shift in the movement from, again, doing the tangible stuff of changing laws to getting together and doing white supremacy workshops. And the kind of most famous leader of all this was the Robin DiAngelo, whose book was #1 New York Times bestseller, huge book, reshaped the whole conversation. And Robin DiAngelo wrote a book called White Fragility. Basically, she said, if you question the list, if you question these parts of internalized whiteness, then you're fighting it. You're fragile. That's your white fragility. You're extra racist. And so it's sort of a trap. And so I went to some of these sessions. I spent 6 days in these, in one particular anti-racist course. And it's very psychological. It's very visceral. It's all about your bodies. It's a lot of like tapping your flesh, getting activated, feeling really white, literally like touching your, like, and then like vibrating and
That's
humming.
very Prince Harry. That's the kind of thing Prince Harry does.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's funny. Like, it's really funny. But also, I mean, you can kind of give it the funny read, which is it's ridiculous and it's silly and it's sort of maybe sweet. It's all these people who really want to make the world better and really want to help, and yet they're doing this to try to help the world. And then you can give it the darker read, which is all the old nonprofits that wanted incremental change, wanted to improve things somewhat here and somewhat there, and fight to have the cops be better trained, and these long held values. They were suddenly pushed to the side by this movement. They were suddenly not just irrelevant, but maybe bad, because
the rise of these entrepreneurs.
They wanted to work within the system. They wanted to compromise. And isn't it more beautiful to not compromise? And so, anyways, this is a topic, but
the thing that I was really noticed, just as I was reading your section, and you're talking about Robin DiAngelo, who everybody here will be familiar with, because everybody over here was also talking about Robin DiAngelo. But funnily enough, I thought, Rennie Edo-Lodge, who wrote Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, is a UK writer, and her book came out before Robin DiAngelo's. And you point out that Robin DiAngelo recommends Rennie Edo-Lodge. And I thought, well, that's so interesting, because we tend to think of the whole race and the different form of anti-racism coming out of the George Floyd moment and coming from the US to over here. But actually, it was already, they'd already taken hold here. And I remember a friend of mine who worked in recruitment, ran a company in recruitment. I mean, they're all salespeople basically, and they're out for their commission. And yet he rang me one day and said, all the young people in my workplace are talking about Rene Edo Lodge's book, and they all want to read it, and they want us to have a reading group in the workplace to discuss this book. And he said, explain it to me. And what the hell do I do? Because he felt that it was such a divisive thing to bring into the workplace. And he had a mixed workforce of white, black, Asian, lots of people from all over. And it wasn't being driven by any particular group in the workplace. It was as enthusiastically embraced by young white people as it was by anybody else. So we were already there and hungry for the George Floyd moment, I think, weren't we? And that's why. What is it about race, do you think? Have you got an understanding of why race has got such a power to it, or this kind of reinvented anti-racism has got such power?
Well, in America, I mean, because a lot of the rage was based in fact, right? A lot of the rage, let's take the 1619 Project. That became kind of the New York Times most famous project. It said we should consider the year 1619, when slaves first came to the US, as our true founding. And the thing about it is, you're like, we should definitely think about 1619. We should know that year. We should consider it an important year in American history. But is it our true founding? Like, was America founded? That's where I'm like, well, I'm not totally sure about that. And basically, what the success of the movement was in part because there's some truth to the fact that that year had been underplayed and had been forgotten. I'd never heard of it before reading the 1619 Project. And then it kind of takes it 5 steps further, where you're like, whoa, wait, hold on. Like, we don't throw out the Constitution, throw out the whole project just because and you get kind of into a chaotic argument. So I think that's part of it. I think there's truth. There's a truth to the video of George Floyd getting killed. And to deny that is to not understand why the movement was successful. And then now, why was this particular anti-racist movement so viral and so good? The Robin DiAngelo model is, I think, because it was a lot easier than the old stuff. Making it psychological and internal, it's easier. Like, the answer in many progressive American cities, San Francisco in particular, the answer to racial discrepancies in math achievement. So in San Francisco, it was very problematic that there's an 8th grade algebra course offered for kids who tested into it. But it was like overrepresentation of Asians and whites, underrepresentation of Black kids. Really overrepresented. It was mostly just a lot of Asians testing into it, which was, again, obviously white supremacy. And the answer to that was not the old liberal way of saying, well, we should improve math education in 5th grade and 6th grade and 7th grade. It was to say, let's ban 8th grade algebra. And that's what the city did. So in a way, the new anti-racism presented a path that was a lot easier. It's a lot easier to say, oh, there's a racial difference in this test outcome. Let's ban the test. You fixed it. You got no more math racial difference in middle school anymore. You fixed it. Beautiful. And that's kind of the knee-jerk reaction to a lot of the problems that they would see.
Yeah, and also then just changing language. I mean, this is where I suppose the free speech aspect comes in, because if you keep shifting the acceptable vocabulary and sort of mystifying, introducing new mystical terms.
Oh, exactly. It's like unhoused person versus homeless person. It's like, it's all these ways to try to make the reality either hard to see by eliminating the class altogether, or kind of obfuscate it, like kind of confuse it, kind of blur it a little, like unhoused person versus homeless. You got the same reality, which is someone living on the sidewalk. So you're not gonna be able to neuter the language enough to eliminate that, but they try. And Yeah, I
Doesn't it
mean,
also allow a sort of educated upper middle class strata to sort of pull the drawbridge up behind them because they can change the language codes.
yeah,
They can say, no, sorry, you're not up to speed, mate. We need to train you, or you're just out because you used the wrong term." And that, I can really see the appeal of that. That
yeah.
sort of distinction and classes distinguishing themselves from one another
It's
as
like
you
a new
climb up the
manners.
ladder.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a new set of very special, very intricate manners.
yeah,
And
yes,
I sometimes when it was first coming out, and it was like new letters on LGBT and all this stuff, and it's kind of funny, but also it's very important. And someone would get fired if they didn't say the right term.
mm,
And the new term came out 6 months ago. So who's supposed to know the right term? But um, I sometimes thought of it as like a waltz, like a very fancy dance that you learn, and you have to know the dance. And if you stutter conjugating someone's they them pronouns, you're seen very clearly as someone who doesn't understand and
yeah,
who's maybe not been properly educated. And it's
yeah,
kind of like a new, yeah, you can definitely see it as new high class manners. There's a writer in America called Rob Henderson who
yeah,
wrote an amazing book called Troubled. And he has termed this idea of luxury beliefs, which is basically that a lot of this can be talked about as basically rich people politics that are fun and that sound interesting in your living room, but
yeah,
that make life for poor Americans or middle class Americans significantly worse.
yeah,
But yeah, the language and the manners and the dance of it and the way it can be used to quickly identify someone who didn't go to the best school because maybe he screws up conjugating they them. Maybe that's hard for him. He's never done it before.
mm,
And
mm,
and suddenly you got someone who just misgendered someone in the workplace. You can fire that guy. Not
yeah,
just can you, you should.
yeah.
Like that shift is amazing.
It
And yeah,
is.
like you
Yeah.
said at the beginning, it's very
Mm,
unusual. It's not traditional leftist culture that would say, well, the kid who got here to this spot who doesn't know all the fancy terminology, he's the first guy in his college family to go to college or whatever. Like we should support this person. We should help this person rise up in the world. Instead, it says no, oust that person.
mm, mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because there's a real sort of disgust at the US or the UK actual working class people. That's why they want the exoticized other to be the people they identify with, whether that's cousins, as they say now. If you really know the language, you don't say cousins, you say cousins. I've noticed that. How's that? Or whoever it is that you're identifying with, it's got to be somebody other than the people who actually live next door to you or you actually work with. I'll try and work my way through some of the Q&A questions. Um, Oh, yeah. So somebody's asking about the sort of motivation of, I suppose, this new priestly class, I suppose. What is the motivation of those, especially sort of government bureaucrats, police, prosecutors, that kind of thing, to sort of introduce woke and DEI? Is it obvious to what role that plays maybe in institutions and in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, it's they want a socialist revolution. You could say let's look at examples. How about um, the comfort with looting small businesses? So in the book, I describe a bunch of fancy New York editors, the editor of the New Yorker, and but a bunch of magazine editors and such, and a bunch of politicians arguing that looting small businesses is okay because actually small businesses aren't so good for the American worker. It's better if it's a big business that's unionized. Even better is if it's a government run program. Small businesses are a little dangerous, and small businesses are so capitalist. And so you had the rhetoric of mainstream liberal voices saying it's okay to burn these down. And so what do you read in that? That reads to me as what they're saying, which is the revolution was used in part as a tool for a broader economic revolution that a lot of these folks have long wanted,
Mm,
and a restructuring of society, greater control in the government. All this stuff that people have long fought for, and that the the chaos of the moment was very useful for.
Yeah, yeah. The thing about property, I think, is really interesting. That sort of relativization of the idea of property ownership. I mean, I hear it the other way around over here. I hear some younger people say, "Well, if you're stealing from a big business, it doesn't matter; they won't even notice." And so you have
Oh,
that
well, this is what
justification.
they all said. But in the American cities that had a lot of looting or a lot of um, burnings of neighborhoods, burnings of commercial districts, the districts that were burned, like in Kenosha, which was a city that was famously quite damaged. The district that was burned was not the wealthy shopping area. It was the poor minority small business area where every single shop was underinsured. I went there, I wandered around. They're all underinsured. No one gets enough insurance to cover their whole place being burned down. No one in that community. And the wealthy white shopping district had all the community board groups and stuff. They immediately boarded up the shops. They immediately had the cops there, and there's a denial of that, but I think the denial is purposeful. The denial of these shops are really screwed. These small businesses are really screwed, and the purpose being there's nothing more capitalistic than small mom and pop businesses. There's nothing more sort of American dream than those, and so they're suspicious.
No, no. It reminds me. I think probably in 2020, I rewatched Spike Lee's "Do the Right Thing." Everything's in there. Really fantastic. So somebody asks, okay, so do you think that the need for conformity is a female thing? When you did suggest earlier on that there's a sort of dynamic that can happen in female relationships where people bond through the mean girl phenomenon kind of
Yeah.
thing. Um,
Yeah. I think other people have said this better than me, but there's definitely a gender dynamic to how some of the, especially the language punishments
mm,
and the kind of policing of language, there's ways in which it's, to me, quite female.
mm,
um but I don't know. I think men are very involved in all of this too. Like you go to up into Seattle, I have a chapter or two about Seattle and the Antifa and that movement. That's a bunch of guys. So
yeah.
I don't think we can entirely blame women for this, but I think some of the way in which it's enforced is, like in academia and in journalism, some of the enforcement is more female. And it
Mm.
is interesting that many of the leaders of cancellations are women, like within those spaces, especially around language.
Mm. Do you think, yeah, it's funny actually, I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet at the moment about misogyny because I never used to think it was a thing. And then,
Oh, it's
yeah,
definitely a
I just
thing.
spot it more. I suppose that I feel like often women are blamed because they're more visible. And so you have the Karen or the blue hair is a woman, isn't it? When people characterize young woke people as the blue hairs, and it's always this kind of the most irrational kind of screamy young woman with the piercings in her face kind of thing. And I just want to, I mean, if you see protests, there are men there, but once their
Sure.
faces are covered, they're kind of invisible. They're not interesting to look at. Whereas the shouty woman or the woman like one of the university encampments who was calling for food aid for the students,
Oh gosh,
she
she was
stands
horrible.
out, right? And is easy to be caricatured. So yeah, I don't know. So I think the guys are getting away with a lot.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think this can be given a purely gendered read. I think there's like different aspects you can talk about that are female aggression, male aggression, how is it playing out, all of that. But the revolution is a multi-gender revolution.
How many, Nellie?
Infinite gender
Infinite.
revolution.
Yeah. Um, I'm just looking for some more. Here's a pessimistic one. Do you think we're through the worst of the craziness, or are we in for a very prolonged period of this new dark age?
I think that some of the most embarrassing, or you could say egregious, um, iterations of it were through the worst of that. I think people are now walking it back. Now we're in the stage of sort of memory holing a lot of what happened, where everyone's trying to pretend like they never said abolish the police. They never said, um, a trans 7-year-old can know themselves well enough to take cross-sex hormones, they would never say that, things such as that, or to take puberty blockers that then lead to cross-sex hormones a few years later. um I don't think that we've had a reform, like a reform movement to it. I think there's spots of optimism that I find for a more moderate voice, but until you have people getting apologies, until you have people getting their old jobs back, it's hard to see it as like, oh, it's done. We're all corrected. Everything's back to normal. I think basically the movement shifted our conversation a big chunk. Sure, the movement wanted to shift it a little further, but we've been shifted. Like, the border policy is not a moderate border policy that we have right now. We kind of have accepted a new normal that is very much shifted.
Mhm.
And I don't know, yeah, if we start seeing some apologies, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR, all these places called the idea of COVID's origins being from a lab a conspiracy theory. And explicitly, they said it's a conspiracy theory, right wing conspiracy.
Mm.
Those articles are still up. Those aren't taken down. Those aren't deleted. Those aren't apologized for. There's no retraction. So if we saw one day a reckoning and people said, you know what, this was wrong. We shouldn't have said this is racist. That was crazy. It's actually totally fair to talk about COVID's origins.
Mm.
Then we could talk about whether we're in a reform and whether we're through the movement and through the revolution. But they're still up.
Mm. Well, who's left? I mean, who's left to actually make that judgment and to
There's
say,
lots of smart. No, there's lots of good people still in those institutions. I mean, the funny thing about so much of the movement, how it won over institutions, I imagine even universities, I obviously saw it through media, is it's a small faction who managed to kind of control the conversation internally. Because it doesn't take that many people to cancel you. It takes maybe like 5, and you're kind of screwed on Twitter. And historically, the newsroom editors, if you've got 5 people in the newsroom saying you should be fired, it's like, woo, it's like 5 people are saying you're racist. And I think that the majority still within these newsrooms, the Times, the Post, are good, smart reporters who don't want to be controlled by this, honestly, like mediocre faction of ideologues.
mm.
They're not the best reporters. It's not the people you turn to for breaking news.
And why was the established media so susceptible to this? I mean, was it just so hungry for anything youthful, for anything that looked like it was coming from a minority? I mean, were they hooked into the same kind of panic about populism as other people were? What was it about the established media that just meant there was so little criticism, whether that was a COVID response or the George Floyd moment or anything else? Why was that, do you think?
I think the established media in America, NPR, New York Times, Washington Post, these have always been liberal. Like, NPR has always been a liberally biased place, but in the sort of normal liberally biased way, not radical. And then I think a few years ago, a group of very cool young people, I was kind of among them at the Times, I was hired in 2017, came in on a mission. And the mission was to hell with objectivity. We all know objectivity isn't perfect, it's flawed, no one's perfectly objective. So why even try? Why even be open minded? Like, we're here to do a more beautiful thing than old fashioned journalism. And I think that was a very compelling message. And I think a lot of the leadership didn't necessarily see the danger in that and sort of thought, we've always been liberals. Maybe let's be a little more. Like, maybe let's like let our free flags fly. Um, I should probably have like a smarter, more I should probably be citing some philosophers in this answer, but I think it was a little bit like foolish leadership and very devoted cohort of young people coming in with a very different idea of what journalism should be.
Mhm.
And then there were the internal tools. I think we've all, if you're in any workplace, you use Slack. We all know Twitter. And these were new tools where rank and file workers could be on par with the editor in chief in
Mm,
a Slack room of 4,000 people, the entire New York Times. And a rank and file worker could call the editor in chief to task in that format and say, I'm mad about this. You have to respond. And within the Times, within all of these news organizations, the leadership felt like they had to respond. There was no, it was like, it was terrifying. They didn't understand that this could happen or this would obviously happen.
mm,
And I think none of them wanted to be on the outs of the movement. None of them
mm.
wanted to be called racist. And
Yeah.
the
I mean, the
movement
power
decides
of
that, yeah, the movement decides that the COVID lab leak is racist. I mean,
mm,
we can talk
mm,
about that for a while, but decides that for whatever reason.
mm,
And basically, the Times editors and leadership who knew better, who are smart people, they're not fools, but they were scared of it and they went along with it. And I know that now they're embarrassed by that. And you see the New Times editor in chief has said that he's a free press reader, which
right. Mm,
we love and appreciate all of our subscribers.
mm.
And I'm sort of delighted by it. I'm
Yeah, well, that's this. That I was going to ask you. Just, I've got one last question, but just before that was whether whether it looks as though things like the free press can actually put pressure back on the established media.
I
Um,
think so. I mean, we're obviously starting our own thing. We left, my wife left first. I left quieter after her. And
yeah,
and we are starting our own, and it's amazing. But I still think institutions are good. Like the New York Times, I want it to be successful and not just commercially successful, which it actually is, even as it goes more and more left. That is working kind of commercially. But I want these places to be good. I want Harvard to be good.
mm,
And so
mm,
I think, yeah, outside pressure, new universities, new or news organizations puts pressure on them and shows we can. There's a whole group of people you're not talking to,
yeah,
and
yeah,
and I mean, part of me, sure, I'd love for us to just grow and one day be bigger than the Times or something crazy, but more realistically, like I think it does improve the American conversation to have competition from the outside and to see it and to say, oh wow, we are missing stories because I'm reading them right here.
mm,
And
yeah,
I'm yeah. And to some extent it's been an advantage to us because the mainstream media for years has has put handcuffs on and handcuffed themselves and said, we're just not covering these stories. Like the pediatric gender debate, they basically were like, we're just not going to cover a lot of the debate that's happening right now around this,
mm,
which for the world of new media was great because we can cover it and we can cover all sides of it and debate it. And it's so like interesting and fraught and complicated and it's juicy as a story. It's a lot there
yeah,
and
yeah,
helpful when all the mainstream media decided we're not going to touch it for at least like 2 or 3 years. And then they come and they accept it. It's like the COVID lab leak. The Times literally today has a story that says COVID might have come from a lab. In the Times today, I'm reading it. I'm like, we've been doing stories after stories of this for the last 3-4 years.
yeah.
It's
Yes.
hilarious.
No, it is, and it's amazing that they can get away with making the people who have been concerned about these stories look like nut jobs
Along
for
the way, yeah.
years. And
And there will
those
never,
people have been monstered.
yes,
Absolutely, the heroic heretics who really need, when they're rehabilitated, I think that's when we'll know we'll have got somewhere. Can we
exactly.
just finish? Can I just ask you what your perspective on the UK is? I mean, how familiar are you with what's going on over here? Is there some cross-fertilization?
I well, my perspective on the UK is I love London, and I once had a really fun night hanging out with Julie Bindel in a pub, and and I'm obsessed with the old lesbians of London, who I would love to join one day, and I no, I mean the UK seems like it's very much ahead in a lot of our conversations that we're having, like it it's already in the Reformation movement, let's say around the Cass report and the conversation around that, you have Biden putting out directives saying we're going all in on pediatric gender medicine and medicalizing 15-year-olds at the same time as the UK is explicitly walking it back. And so that's really interesting to me, that divergence. I think the UK is ahead in a lot of conversations here, and it's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's only I don't think it would have happened without really, really well organized activism by people like Julie Bindel. There's a sort of, maybe there's something about a smaller, more homogenous political entity that means that these people had a lot of experience of campaigning over the years, kind of kicked back into gear. And it's really interesting and lovely actually seeing people rediscover their networks to try to push back about, particularly from people from the LGB Alliance and sort of Sex Matters, these kind of feminist and LGB groups who have been incredibly effective at pushing back.
There's a culture in the UK of debate, and there's a culture of rhetoric, and that's, to my eyes from the outside, it seems like it's been very valuable, and it's been somewhat maintained in a way that American debate and rhetoric as an idea, like, even our campus debate clubs, we've had a bunch of stories on how the debate clubs on college campuses and high school campuses people won't take positions that they don't like, and the judges won't give points to the positions that they don't like explicitly. They'll say like we're and it's so absurd. And I think that that represents a difference in American versus UK culture a little bit. Like we're willing to toss that aside, whereas I feel the UK,
yeah, I think they've been on life support over here, and one of the the FSU is one of the life support sort of systems by helping out debate societies to keep going and to kind of give legal advice to people who have been no platformed, all of those kinds of things. That I don't know what would have happened if we didn't exist, and if there's so many different campaign groups that have made a real difference. I think without blowing up the trumpet, I genuinely don't know what would happen otherwise. It wouldn't have come from the top. Put it that way. Wasn't a natural
thank
kickback.
God you guys are around. I mean, it's amazing. But and the number of members you have with just 4 years of being around, it's incredible.
Yeah. Well, it just shows the problem, really. I mean, we may be the solution, but the problem is the problem exists. So yeah. Right, I'm going to let you go.
Thank you so much for
thanks so much, Nellie. I really enjoyed reading the book, and I do recommend it to people. Keep an eye out at Nellie. She's, well, you said this is your last media appearance, so you can go. People can go and find your other ones.
I'm too pregnant. I'm too pregnant to be on pods anymore. I gotta hide. This was
go into confinement.
This was really a pleasure, and
yeah. Well, thanks so much.
I'm a fan of what you guys are doing.
Oh well, thank you, and good luck with the baby.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.